Fantastic.
Sweet. And it's like, all right, I guess, yeah, we can give you the extra minute or so you have a little bit
more time. Fantastic.
Start whenever you're ready.
All right, so before I begin, I'd actually like to give a couple of disclaimers. So first and foremost, this talk could not possibly cover everything that I would like to talk about, even as quickly as I'm going to go through it. Second is that because written works are open to interpretation, I might stress the importance of certain things over others because of my experiences in the industry or my tastes. I will also admit that I am not very good at image editing or formatting. I was going to fix it last night, didn't have the time or the energy to. With that said, we are now entering difficulty level Cipher. So the first thing I would like to note is that the English language is an incredibly complex thing, and that isn't really helped by the fact that it's constantly evolving. What is natural today might be seen as cliche or perhaps even contrived in as little as 10 years. So realistically, it's no wonder that writers constantly ask themselves, is this dialogue or narration okay? Does it flow well? What about this exchange between these two characters, or even the scene as a whole? Although the answers may seem obvious to some of us, in my experience, it's a lot harder to actually catch potential issues with dialogue and flow or naturalism. What's worse is that even when you do, it can be a delicate balancing act between naturalism and maintaining your intentions. Since natural flowing writing is the product of a few smaller things, I'm actually going to discuss several important points and the various strategies that these include and incorporate. So the first thing I want to talk about, as you can see on the slide here, is that dialogue doesn't need to be perfectly grammatically correct. It should definitely approach that and be readable, but communication is often messy. As noted here, we talk in sentence fragments, talk in circles, talk with awkward punctuation, or even interrupt one another. At times, we might use non sequiturs by suddenly changing topics, whether we mean to or not. Despite all that mess, there are patterns to how people speak. We all have our preferred phrases, our general degree of formality, things like that. Even how we punctuate and emphasize words or certain sentence lengths over others can have an influence on what we say and how we say it. Basically, we all have these little verbal tics that make us distinct, and actual characters should be no different. In fiction, it's important to remember that these tics are actually just an aspect of dialogue and not a substitute for dialogue. The way a character speaks should definitely be flexible, and tics shouldn't interfere with how dialogue flows. Because in some cases, you run into like it's very ham-fisted and forced. I've had some difficulty finding some bad examples, but I do have some that I would consider good. So in this example, which I will leave on screen for a moment so everybody can kind of digest it, in the first image on the right, we can clearly see that one character, Gabriel, is very foul-mouthed and somewhat abrasive. About 5 scenes later, you can see from the context of the scene that she's around children and therefore is trying her hardest not to swear, even though she doesn't always succeed at that. At the same time, we can also see that another character, Floris, has a stutter. There are situations where she obviously becomes annoyed, surprised, or comfortable enough to speak normally, or to simply spit out what she's trying to say, usually in response to Gabriel. That actually brings me to my next point. So you are going to have this hammered into your head throughout this talk. Context is literally the most important thing when it comes to writing character dialogue. Now, I'm using Ace Attorney as the example here. So in this example, the reader can see that Phoenix Wright is somewhat spacey and nervous in his first case, which is on the top, compared to a somewhat more professional demeanor in case 2, where not only does he have the experience of having been in the courtroom, but he also has a vested interest in the case because of what it entails. For those of you who haven't played Ace Attorney, basically what happens is that his mentor ends up being murdered. So in this next example, also from Ace Attorney, you can see that his inner thoughts are often somewhat more analytical than his dialogue would probably let on. In some situations, these thoughts are actually sarcastic, which you can kind of see in the bottom. Both of these illustrate there are more aspects to his character than we might initially think, even though he doesn't necessarily reveal that to other characters in the story. In short, you could say that he's well-rounded because he reacts, and that we get an insight into his character through his actions, the things he does, the things he doesn't do, the things he says, and how he says them. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is pacing, exposition, repetition, and redundancy. Actually, I guess I need to breathe. We will now return to your regularly scheduled Cipher Speed Talk. So basically, how information is conveyed to the reader and how a scene is paced are extremely important too. Info dumping is generally a bad idea, but expositional dialogue is usually impossible to avoid. It's usually best to of a conversation topic come up naturally, or to use actions and context to communicate things to a reader. So here I'm using Umineko as an example. In the very first scene of the game, Battler says that he hasn't seen his cousin Maria in about 6 years. It's previously established that she's 9, so saying that she's 3 is obviously quite redundant, or that she was 3 at the time is obviously quite redundant. And you can also see that 1 or 2 screens, which is just a matter of paragraphs later, his father repeats a similar sentiment in a much more natural way. Simply put, even if Battler would reasonably think to himself before someone says it outright, it's redundant to present this information twice. A more natural introduction of this information comes right after. Following this dialogue, Battler even says that it's been 6 years since he's seen anyone, including, and obviously that would include Maria. This is already established earlier in the scene with the way that he interacts with his aunt and uncle and his cousin. We can also find an example of unnecessary exposition earlier in the scene. So Battler introduces each of his family members like this throughout both the scene. Some things, like their relation to him and his opinion of them, are okay to state on some level, but are usually better left in subtext or their interactions with him. For example, a lot of Hideyoshi's dialogue reveals that he's generally sociable, he's nice to the kids, and yeah, that it can just, you can infer that from what's being said. What's interesting about this is that psychologically speaking, the more something is repeated, the less important your brain registers it as being. This applies both to broader concepts, such as Battler not seeing Maria in forever, but also to individual words. So in one of these earlier examples, you can see a repetition of the word year, specifically on the bottom. And although it's not really a major issue with this scene, it does have an effect on the pacing and does have an effect on the way the reader the reader takes it in. So another example of repetition applied to individual words can be found in Watercress's Palinaris. I'd like you to keep in mind that the game was written in about 6 days and hasn't been fully edited, so I would like to cut my fellow devs that are here some slack. But you can see that above you have a necessary repetition of the word space. While mild, your brain gradually starts to go, what the hell is this? And then eventually it just kind of stops meaning anything. As such, it's generally best to vary up word choice, as you can see in my rewrite, as well as things like punctuation and sentence length whenever possible. So I could keep going on about this forever, but I'd like to get to some Q&A if I can. So I'm going to give my final thoughts, even though they're a bit disjointed. So the first thing is that communication is mostly nonverbal. We in the visual novel industry have the benefit of things like art to create context and subtext. Voice acting can also steer the reader's interpretations of certain lines and how they read, which will in turn affect the tone and mood of the scene. These things together will affect the flow, tone, and other things like that as far as the writing is concerned. One of my clients actually summed it up best as, it's usually better if you view your visual novel as a script more than a novel, which makes sense. We call it scripting for a reason, right? Secondly, narration is just internal dialogue, as noted earlier in this talk. It's often more grammatically complete, is usually cut off less, has fewer verbal tics, and is slightly more flexible as a result of these things. But it's still typically held to many of the same standards as standard dialogue, specifically the weight of context and things like that. Next, paying more specific attention to our conversations and the media that we consume can help you internalize what makes good or bad dialogue. Some dialogue is even intentionally bad or repetitive. One example that comes to mind actually from Umineko is in the first scene, as I believe it's Kinzo is dying. He keeps calling out to Beatrice, and that really highlights the desperation that he feels in that moment. Lastly, if you're going to take anything away from this talk, it should be, it should be these. So basically, dialogue should be flexible. Context is important. Repetition is usually bad. And you shouldn't be afraid to cut or change things in the interest of flow, regardless as to whether or not it's an original work or if you're editing something that's been localized. With that said, if you guys have any Q&A, I would appreciate an @ mention, just because when I do my script, I'd like to get to literally all of the ones that I can. So the first question, any tips on how you can coach writers to avoid word repetitions besides just pointing it out again and again and again? Honestly, that is a very difficult question because it depends on the writer and the types of words and sentences that they create. Personally, my preferred method is to just show them some examples, and eventually they'll internalize the lesson of you can use synonyms, you can rewrite the sentence. Sometimes it's necessary and sometimes it's unnecessary. How do you make consistency of character voice across multiple authors on the team? That's usually a very difficult thing to do. Frankly, I still struggle with it, so I don't necessarily know if I have particularly good advice. But more often than not, what I do is I look at a character and I go, yeah, so I look at a character and I go, okay, this character generally speaks within these parameters. So they're usually a bit more formal, or they're usually a bit more brash or blunt, or they have a stutter or things like that. And then I look to see how they're implemented, and I make sure that it's not overly jarring. Like, you shouldn't be able to, in a lot of cases, you shouldn't be able to tell that multiple writers worked on something, other than perhaps some variance in style. What are your thoughts on cutting fluff equals less playtime? The unfortunate reality is some players seem to value playtime more than being concise. Well, this is more of a subjective thing. I think that personally, artificially padding playtime through filler content, because that's what I consider this to be, is not a good thing. What you want is you want your reader to come out, even if they analyze every line, because like that's what I do because it's my job. You're gonna want them to come out feeling like they've had a complete experience, and not like, oh my god, that lasted forever and a day.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions. Just answer them in chat, because
yeah, no problem.
I'm going to pass it over to Rukia.
All right.
You set? All right, but then we can keep going because there's a lot of writing.